You don't know what you like anymore. Not really. Somewhere between becoming what they needed and keeping the peace, you misplaced yourself. That's not love. That's a pattern that started long before you ever met them. Picture a child who learned that the way to stay safe in a relationship was to disappear into the other person's needs. Not dramatically, quietly, adjusting, shrinking, mirroring. The parent was volatile, or fragile, or simply more present when the child reflected them back. So the child became a mirror, good at reading rooms, good at being whatever the room required. Psychologists call this enmeshment, when a child's sense of self becomes fused with a caregiver's emotional state, and their own identity never fully separates. The child grows up. The pattern doesn't. Here's what it looks like now. The first sign is that your personality shifts depending on who you're with. I just adapt easily. That's what you call it. It isn't adaptability. It is the absence of a fixed self underneath the adapting. With one person, you are one version. With another, someone different. Not because you are curious and open, because you were never fully taught that your own preferences, opinions, and edges were safe to keep. In a home where having a self-caused friction, erasing it was the smarter move. You got very good at becoming what the relationship needed. The problem is, you brought that skill into every relationship since. And at some point, the adapting stops being a choice and starts being the only mode you know. This isn't flexibility. This is what happens when a child learned that having a self was a social risk. If that is familiar, leave a 1 in the comments. But the second sign is where it gets harder to ignore. The second sign is that their mood becomes your emergency. They're quiet. You scan for what you did. They seem off. You restructure your entire evening around fixing it. You cannot relax inside a relationship until the other person is okay. Their emotional state is the weather, and you are permanently checking the forecast. This is not sensitivity. This is hypervigilance that was trained on a parent whose moods were unpredictable and whose emotional regulation was your responsibility. You learned to track another person's inner world with precision because getting it wrong had consequences. That tracking never stopped. It just moved into your adult relationships, and it costs you your own inner world because there is no bandwidth left for it. This isn't care. This is what happens when a child was made responsible for someone else's emotional survival before they had finished their own. The third sign is that you don't know who you are outside of a relationship. Single, you feel shapeless, undefined, like a noun that needs a sentence around it to mean anything. You pick up their interests, their rhythms, their way of seeing things, and when it ends, you're left holding a life that was assembled around someone else. Then you meet the next person, and the assembly begins again. Dorothy Tenoff called this limerence, the state of being consumed by another person's reality. But what you have is older than any relationship. It is the original condition, a self that was never fully allowed to form, because forming it would have disrupted someone more important. This isn't devotion. This is what happens when a child's identity was built around someone else's needs from the very beginning. If that one landed, leave a 2 in the comments. The last sign is the one that keeps the whole cycle running. Now stop for a second. Losing yourself in relationships is not a character flaw. It is an extremely logical response to growing up in a home where having a self was inconvenient. You learned to merge because merging kept you safe. The problem is that the relationship you are in now is not that home, and the person you are disappearing for may not even be asking you to. The fourth sign, and the deepest one, is that being alone with yourself feels unbearable. Not sad, unbearable. Like a static that builds the longer no one else is in the room. You fill it with plans, with contact, with the next person, because the silence of your own company has never felt like rest. It has always felt like absence. What you are running from is not loneliness. It is the self you never fully built. The quiet exposes how unfamiliar you are to yourself. And so you reach for the next relationship, not because you are ready, but because being inside one is the only place you have ever felt like you exist. That is not connection. That is using another person as a mirror because you were never given one of your own. Here is what is actually true. You cannot find yourself inside a relationship. You can only bring yourself to one. The shift is learning to tolerate your own company. not as punishment, but as practice. Sit with your own preferences, your own opinions, your own discomfort, without immediately routing them through another person. The second truth, their mood is not your responsibility. Tracking it was a survival skill. Releasing it is a choice. Every time you let them feel something without fixing it, you take back a piece of your own nervous system. The third truth, a relationship where you have disappeared is not a relationship. It is an occupation. The version of you that shows up fully, with edges and preferences, and a self that doesn't dissolve, is the only version capable of being actually loved. It started with a child who learned that having a self was a liability. That child became someone who is incredible at intimacy and terrible at selfhood, who gives everything, becomes everything, and wakes up one day in a life shaped entirely around someone else's gravity. The cost is concrete. It is the opinions you stopped having, the friendships you let thin out because they didn't fit the relationship, the version of you that existed before, curious, particular yours, that you can barely remember now. What would change? Not tomorrow, not after some long process. If you finally stopped making yourself small enough to fit inside someone else's life and started building one that was actually your own. Send this to someone who always seems to completely transform when they're in a relationship. They probably don't see it yet, and this might be the thing that finally names it.